Well, good morning, everyone. My name is Catherine Perkins. I'm executive producer for talk shows at Iowa Public Radio. And it is my pleasure to be here today and to introduce our first panel and the moderator for our first panel about the pipeline and women running for office. Renee Schulte is the owner of Schulte Consulting, LLC. She's a former legislator and mental health therapist. Renee spearheaded the passage of a mental health and disability services redesign in the 2011 and 2012 sessions. Her work on this reform won 9 awards, including the Iowa Mental Health Counselor Association Award for Bipartisan Leadership in 2012, the Gold Star Award from the Iowa Sheriffs and Deputies Association in 2012, and the Iowa Hospital Association Legislator of the Year, also in 2012. Schulte Consulting offers strategic planning in mental health, healthcare, legislative process, and environment. Renee is married to Brent, the discipleship pastor at Antioch Christian Church, and she lives in Cedar Rapids. Please welcome Renee Schulte.
Good morning, everyone. As she said, I am Renee Schulte, and I am a recovering politician. I would like to tell you my story about becoming involved in politics because it's very different from a lot of what you're going to hear today. I never took a poli-science class in my life. I didn't like history. I grew up in Illinois. Most of our governors went to jail. It was not on my parents' wish list for me to ever be involved in politics. So what happened next is something that people need to know because it's a very important process as to how women become involved in politics. I was actually asked to run for office. I was recruited by a couple at my church. I'd heard a sermon at church that said something about the effect that I should be involved in government, that I should be praying for my leaders in my country. And I went to the back of my church building to get a copy of that CD, and I thought, you know, maybe I should do something like school board. I had foster kids at the time in my house who were not getting what they needed out of the school system. And I thought, you know, school board, we've had a lot of fights with them, and my kids aren't getting the services they need, so maybe I should do something with the school board. So I go back to the back, and I talk to this couple, and this lady, she's almost 80 at this point in time, and she's jumping up and down, so excited that I want to get involved in politics. And I don't understand, and she says, you need to come and see me for lunch. So I walk in to see them for lunch on a Friday, and sitting in front of me is the retiring Senator Chuck Larson, along with her husband, Kurt, and it's Kurt and Norma Hames, who are big donors in the Republican Party, which I did not know that that was any history that they had. I walk in and I see Chuck Larson, and I'm thinking, uh-oh, what is this? And I think, because I've never taken a poli-science class in my life, and I don't know anything about politics, that somebody retiring from office like a Chuck Larson would have somebody in the wings to take his spot. I thought that the way this worked is you had your next person, that it was more of a successor, kind of like, you know, some of the shows you see on TV where the next person, you know who it's going to be, it's a foregone conclusion, the big money comes in, make sure they're chosen and all of that. And that is not what happened. He stepped out to retire and there was no one to run for that seat. So they told me at this lunch that I'm going to be the next state senator. And this is in 2005. So I remember sitting there thinking to myself, well, that is the craziest thing I've ever thought. And so I'm not going to argue. I respect my elders. My mom did teach me well. So I'm sitting there thinking, this is insane. And so I was asked by a person in the room, if you ran for the state senate, what would you do? And I said, I would reform the mental health system. To which I was told, nobody runs to do that. And I'm like, well, then I'm not going to do it because I don't want to run. And I sat there, and what happened, though, I'm in this little meeting for 10 minutes, and I'm not kidding. They take me from this to this other meeting for lunch, and it's the power hour lunch that, as a legislator, I became a part of later in life, but didn't know what it was at this time. So I go to the country club. I'm sitting in the country club with a former Speaker of the House, a current minority leader, former mayor, a current mayor, all of these folks that are in the Republican Party sitting there, and they are told she is going to be the next state senator in Iowa. And I'm sitting there thinking, what is happening to me? So I get up, breathing, excuse myself to go to the restroom, and try not to throw up. And I'm standing in the bathroom thinking, I have no idea what's just happening to me. But I'm like, okay, there's got to be something they see that I don't. So I need to listen, and I'm kind of praying and going, okay, what is happening? So I go back to the table, and what happened that day is every time they asked me questions, they liked me. And I don't even recall what the questions were. To this day, I can't tell you what they asked me. And that started the journey for me running for office. I ran that first time and lost. It was a terrible year for Republicans in 2006, if you remember that year. It was a wave across the country after the second Bush term. So it was a terrible year for a Republican to want to sign up to run for office. I didn't know that. I didn't know any better. I was told to go out and knock every door in that district, and I did. I learned later that a lot of state senators don't knock an entire Senate district, because that's a lot of houses, but I didn't know, so I did. And then I lost, and I lost 60-40. And I came up in sports. I am an athlete. I played basketball, I played softball, I was a competitive swimmer. 60-40 is a whooping, right? Not in politics. People came out to me, they were so excited I got 40% on my first time out. Okay, well that's a shift in my head. I'm like, 40%'s a good thing. That's an F everywhere I've ever been. It's an F. And so they're like, no, that's great as a first-time candidate. And I'm like, what are you talking about? And so it was a very publicized race, very ugly race. I was threatened to be sued during that race and swore I am never, ever doing that again. Well, that lasted about 3 months. We also lost the House seat that I lived in that year during that wave in 2006. And so the minority leader came to find me, probably gave me 3 or 4 months to stay on my never ever do it again. But by about March that year, I remember something happening, and I won't go into the details, but there was a policy bill that happened in the State House that I was just, I don't know what happened to me, but I was just crushed over this piece of policy. And I was almost in tears in my house thinking, uh-oh, I really care about policy. Darn it, I'm gonna have to run again. And sure enough, they came in and asked me to run. So in 2008, as a Republican in a Democrat seat, I won by a whopping 13 votes. And then I got reelected in 2010. But then in 2012, we had the redistricting in the state of Iowa. As you know, it's a nonpartisan redistricting. And that nonpartisan redistricting made my seat much more Democrat. And so I lost by pretty close to what the actual numbers are in that district. I was never running in a Republican seat. And so now I'm back out. And I can tell you that the 4 years that I spent there were some of the best years of my life. And there's nothing that was hard that I wouldn't have repeated. I have had so many life lessons learned through that journey that even if you want to do it and you're there one term, it is amazing what this will do for you. And so I'm here just to say this morning that we're going to have some great people on our panel, and we're going to talk specifically about why they got involved in running for office. A couple of them have a PowerPoint presentation that they're going to show you and talk about. They've got some real history in writing books on what we need to talk about for running for office and what we need. We're going to also talk about what we can do to make the decision to run for women easier, and to talk about what kinds of things would help other women run. I know for me, the biggest piece, and this is going to sound crazy, was ignorance. Because I didn't know how ugly it was going to get, so I didn't know. And so if I'd have known the magnitude of the television ads and the things that have been said about me the first time around, I probably would have been a little less likely to do that. Because even my husband, you know, it's my husband's name, and we really had to think about that. Is that something we want our name attached to, is what happened. But looking at it from this side, I am so glad that I figured that out. And honestly, a lot of that stuff doesn't matter anymore. I got a lot thicker skin. So we're going to talk about some of those things like thick skin that we need to have if we're going to be ladies and run, because we cannot worry about what everybody thinks about us if we're going to do this. And the reasons for running, before we bring up our panel, there's a few things that women do differently in office. And I'm not somebody that says that you should have it one way or the other, but we do things, we bring a different perspective to the table. And it's important that you know that. We have expertise and experiences that are different. So my expertise in mental health and my trajectory through all the levels of mental health care that I worked in is exactly what had to be there in order to reform that system. Somebody else without that background couldn't do that job. And so had I not stepped up to run, there wouldn't have been able to be that detailed conversation on what's wrong with that system to fix it, because I had the expertise that they didn't have. And it became very obvious as soon as I got there. I actually ran to prove that. that I thought, well, people up there don't seem to know what they're doing related to this. And I got there, and it was pretty clear that we didn't have a lot of people that knew what they were doing. So, but it wasn't because they weren't good-hearted and weren't trying. They just didn't understand the issues. And so whatever issue you're an expert on, if you don't run, they don't know. So if you're there mad about that they've done X, Y, and Z to mess up the issue in which you live, chances are they don't even understand the issue from your perspective to know that it's messed up or even know how to fix it if they wanted to. So your expertise and experience is necessary at the table. Women also bring a different style of negotiation and collaboration. We just do it different. And so men, there's a lot of testosterone, there's a lot of bully puppet, there's a lot of actually physical altercations. You can talk to Amy about that in the Senate this year. She's had some front row seat at some stuff going on up there this year that's been different than usual. It's just different, but it's just the guy thing. Women, we don't do it like that. We are behind the scenes, getting things done, making it work, don't care so much about the credit sometimes, you know, just making it happen. And so you're necessary. The Affordable Care Act expansion of Medicaid would not have happened without women in the State House. It was Amanda Reagan in the Senate, and it was Linda Upmeyer in the House, who behind the scenes made that work. Now there was a gentleman's name at the top of that who ran the bill, but that is not the whole story. It would not have happened without those two women. And the last thing that women bring to it is we really have what I call it is a stick-to-itiveness, a get things done. It's a persistence, a determination that when a woman gets on something, we're like a bulldog, man. If we get a bone, we're on it. And that's because I think there's that natural instinct to protect our families and our kids, but it's also that we know what it takes to get it finished. And so you don't get distracted. You stay on it and get it done. And that's a little different than some other ways that people think up there. So your skill set is necessary in this pipeline. And it takes every one of us here, if we're going to get to 50-50 in 2020, all of us need to make this work. So now I'm going to bring up our panelists, and if all four of you would like to join us on stage, I'll just introduce them one at a time as they, all of you, come on. I'll introduce them before they do their presentation. And the way this is going to work is each of them are going to sit up here on the panel. They're going to come to this podium to speak for you. They should have 10 to 15 minute remarks prepared. A couple of them have PowerPoint presentations that are going to go along, and I hope somebody can help us with that because I don't know how to do that. And then I'm going to sit in the back, and at the conclusion of all four presentations, we're going to take questions from the audience. Does that make sense? So our first presenter is going to be Kira. Kira, and I'm not going to try your last name. I'll go with Professor Kira. She's a professor of political science and senior scholar at the Center for American Women in Politics at the Eagleton Institute of Politics, Rutgers University. Her new book with Susan J. Carroll is called More Women Can Run, Gender and Pathways to the State Legislature. She's also an author of Where Women Run, author of Where Women Run, Gender and Party in American States and Democrats, Republicans, and the Politics of Women's Place. So please introduce and welcome Professor Kira.
I do need some help with PowerPoint.
Yes. Do we know who can help her with the PowerPoint presentation?
Oh, okay.
There it is.
Is it a clicker?
There it is.
Okay, beautiful. Thank you. Great. Well, thank you for having me. So I'm Kira Sambanmatsu. I'm from Rutgers University, and I'm also a senior scholar at the Center for American Women in Politics, and it's really great to be here. And it's wonderful to see such a great turnout. And I just want to thank Peter, Leslie. Oh, okay. Can you hear me now? I'd like to thank Peter, Leslie, Tracy, and also Diane for bringing me here. Is the sound okay now? Yes, okay, great. So I am going to do two things in my talk. The first is I wanted to provide a little background about where we stand with regard to women's election to office, and I'm going to do that with some data from the Center for American Women in Politics. And I want to also talk a little bit about my new book with Susan Carroll about how men and women reach the legislature. So the first thing I want to show you is just some, over time, statistics about the percentage of women in Congress. So these are data from the 50 states, and this is kind of where we stand nationally with regard to women's representation. And so what you can see is that women's representation in Congress is increasing, but women remain underrepresented. So women today are 18.5% of Congress. Iowa is not yet in our data, so we're really hoping, that this year Iowa will make it in there. So good luck. Democratic women are doing better than Republican women in Congress. These data are the raw number of women in Congress. So while women's representation in both parties has increased, that has been more likely to be happening for the Democrats. Turning to where we stand in the 50 states for state legislative office, what we see is that women are 24.2% of all state legislators nationally. This means that women are better represented at the state legislative level than at the congressional level. We have seen gains, although what we notice is that pretty much since about 1999, there's been what we've been considering a plateau in women's office holding. In the 70s and 80s, it looked like a pretty kind of straightforward growth model of increasing every year in terms of women's state legislative representation. And state legislatures are important because states are important, but also because as we just heard, it's often the first office that people seek. So what we've been seeing in recent years is a little bit surprising. So growth has been slower than we would have expected. Also breaking this out by party, Democratic women are growing more than Republican women. Even if you take into account how the two parties are doing in terms of all state legislative seats, if you look at Democratic women as a percentage of Democrats and Republican women as a percentage of Republicans, you still see a pattern where Democratic women are doing better than Republican women. This was not the pattern earlier in this time series. So it used to be that Democratic and Republican women were doing about the same with regard to state legislative representation. So this is something that's changed. And of course, we know that the Republican Party is increasingly successful, obviously in controlling the U.S. House, but in gaining state legislative seats in chambers across the country. And so what seems to be happening is that while Republican women, in terms of raw numbers, have gained in state legislative and congressional seats, they're not doing as well as their male counterparts. They're not sharing. They don't seem to be sharing in the party's success. One more set of statistics has to do with statewide office. So these are offices, there are over 300 statewide positions across the country in terms of governor, lieutenant governor, secretary of state, and so on. And in terms of these numbers, where we stand nationally right now is 22.6%. Interestingly, this is actually a decline. So we're actually seeing these numbers going down, down from what the peak had been. I'm going to break this out by raw numbers by party. This is just raw numbers of Democratic and Republican women in these statewide positions. Today, what you can see is, unlike the pattern for state legislative and congressional office holding, Republican and Democratic women, in terms of raw numbers, are doing pretty similarly at this level, which is interesting. Also, there are only 5 women governors across the country today. 4 out of 5 are Republicans, so that's very interesting. That's definitely an area where Democratic women seem to be lagging behind Republican women. I have one slide about Iowa. So Iowa, we see in terms of the state legislature, we know that state legislative office holding has increased for women in Iowa, and this is kind of data broken out by party, women as a share of Democratic and Republicans in the legislature, and kind of like the national pattern, Democratic women are better represented than our Republican women. In terms of the 50 states, Iowa, as you may know, is kind of in the middle of the pack with regard to state legislative representation. Iowa is ranked 27th, so that's about kind of average for the country. So that's kind of some background about kind of where things stand. And then for the second part of my comments, I wanted to talk a little bit about research that we've done about women's pathways to the state legislature specifically. We think looking at state legislatures is important because it's often an entry-level office, and it's a very important kind of set of institutions to study. And of course, all states are different, but all states have state legislatures. We were particularly interested in this question because, you know, there was that plateau I showed you where we're kind of hovering around 24% in terms of women's state legislative representation. So in the book I've written with my colleague at Rutgers, Susan Carroll, we're taking a look at why this plateau exists and how we might think about strategies to increase women's state legislative representation. So the data, I'm going to just briefly, I only have a few minutes, so I'm just going to briefly tell you what's in the book. And what we did was we revisited a study that the Center for American Women in Politics had done in 1981, which was a 50-state survey of women state legislators and their male colleagues. And what that survey did was look at backgrounds, kind of where were men and women coming from to reach the legislature, what did they do before they got into the legislature, how did they make the decision to run, and so on. So we revisited that study in 2008, and we basically replicated the instrument, but we ended up adding a few additional questions. So basically this is kind of a then and now look at how women and men are getting to the legislature. So we kind of are comparing women with men, and then we're comparing then and now. And so I know we sent our survey to all of the state legislators. So if any of you in the room filled out our survey, we thank you very much, because this is based on your responses. So, and so we couldn't have done this without the participation of state legislators from all over the country. Okay, so really quickly, I want to make 3 arguments today about what we found. And one thing that was evident in the 1981 study is that there were gender differences in the pathway to office. Men and women were coming from different occupations. Men and women were tending to get there with more support. Women were tending to get to the legislature with more support, and so on. And basically, while we find some evidence of women assimilating to men's pathways to office between 1981 and 2008, and some evidence of convergence in men's and women's pathways, we argue that basically most of the evidence when you compare men's and women's backgrounds is persistent differences. So there were differences in how men and women got to the legislature in 1981, and these have continued, and we see those in 2008. So for example, women remain more likely than men to be coming out of backgrounds in health and education, more so than traditionally male-dominated occupations like business and law. We do see more women state legislators coming from business and law today than in the past, but we still see kind of some differences there in the kind of careers that state legislators are coming from. We also found in 1981 and in 2008, women were more likely to have political experience, more likely to have worked on campaigns, more likely to have worked on member of a staff, and more likely to have participated in a campaign training. So what we find, again, is gender differences. I'm getting my 5-minute warning, so I better talk faster. Okay, so that's one set of arguments. Okay, here's why we call it, the second point I want to make is more women can run. That's the title of the book. Basically, what we're arguing is that, you know, there isn't a single path to the legislature. We just heard of a path where someone had never thought about it, wanted to work, maybe there's some recruitment, some interest in an issue, but there are a lot of different ways one can get to the legislature, and there's also been this persistent differences in pathways. So we think that there are a lot more women out there in America and in Iowa who could run for the legislature, because there are a lot of women working in these female-dominated occupations like health and education. So we think that there are plenty of women today who could be seeking office. We also find that in our data there's some evidence that women are more likely to be motivated by public policy and to want to make a difference on policy, and that's what's getting them there. The third argument is we argue that women's decisions, more often than men's, were influenced by the beliefs and reactions of others, and to involve considerations of how candidacy and office holding would affect the lives of other people. We call this relationally embedded candidacy. So we find a lot of evidence that women are getting to office more often than men through encouragement, through recruitment, having organizational support, and so we think that women are more likely than men to be pulled into politics. And so we think this is important to understanding how, strategizing about how to get more women in there. They're less likely to have had a longstanding desire to be in politics, okay, than men. Men are more likely to express that motivation. For example, state legislators who first ran for the legislature as their first elective office, women more likely than men the idea of running for office was suggested to them. It's less likely that the idea for running initiated with the woman. There's some women that's how they're getting there, but more often than not, it's through some kind of recruited process. So my last slide is we think that there are kind of some specific ideas going forward that everybody in this room could get involved in terms of increasing women's election to office. So we think that we could think more broadly about who could run and serve in terms of where the kinds of occupations that lead to running for office, policy motivations, and so on. We think that recognizing that role of parties in women's election to office is very important because we do see more evidence that women are relying on party support, that they are more likely to be recruited than men to run. Getting over any efforts to discourage women's candidacies is also important. We find even though we're looking at state legislators, so these are people who have made it, they were successful, they still had to overcome some efforts to discourage their candidacy. So I think parties can be positive forces, but we know that parties can also be selective and they can be negative gatekeepers. So, and we also know that the gendered nature of society is that women and men tend to have some somewhat different networks, and so having women in party leadership roles is very important. So thank you.
Thank you. That was really good work. I look forward to reading the book.
Thanks.
Our next presenter is Jennifer Lawless. She received her PhD in political science from Stanford University in 2003 and her BA in political science from Union College in 1997. She's a professor of government at American University, where she is also the director of Women in Politics Institute. She's the author of Becoming a Candidate, Political Ambition and a Decision to Run for Office, and the lead author of It Still Takes a Candidate, Why Women Don't Run for Office. Please welcome Jennifer.
Thank you very much. I'm loud, so I assume you can hear me quite well. So today I'm going to talk about what happens before what Kira told you about, which is basically the gender gap in political ambition, or anybody that's familiar with Cyndi Lauper, Why Women and Girls Just Want to Not Run. By the way, this title's totally lost on today's college population, which is devastating to me on a personal level. As Kira mentioned, women are not doing so well. Men currently occupy the overwhelming majority of elected positions, whether we're looking at the local level, the state level, or the federal level. And shockingly, 95 nations now actually surpass the United States in the percentage of women serving in the national legislature. What's more than this is that not only have we seen a plateau over time in terms of the percentage of women serving in state legislative offices and statewide elected offices in the United States, but over the course of the last 15 years when I've been doing this work, the US ranking globally has consistently gone down and down and down. So a lot of other nations are getting it in a way that the United States is not. What is fundamentally tricky about understanding these numbers is that study after study shows that when women run for office, they fare as well as their male counterparts. Both in terms of vote totals and fundraising receipts, they're just as likely to succeed. When you compare female incumbents against male incumbents, female challengers against male challengers, women and men running in open seats, there's no systematic bias against women. Voters are willing to elect them. We've also seen increasing attention and evidence to suggest that women and men, with the exception of maybe the woman running for president in 2008, receive very comparable media coverage. And so it's very difficult to make the argument that systematic gender bias in the media is working to the detriment of female candidates. So why is it when we have election outcomes that seem to suggest gender parity, and we have women and men who are now occupying these pipeline professions in pretty comparable numbers, how is it possible that 80% of our elected officials across the country are men? And so starting in about 2000, Richard Fox, who's at Loyola Marymount University, and I have been conducting surveys of thousands and thousands of women and men who occupy the pipeline professions to political careers, and we've asked them about their political ambition and whether they've ever considered running for office. Now, I should step back and say that it's very difficult to survey people about something they have not done. And so up until our study, most of the research on political ambition focused on people who had it. They could report retrospectively about why they had it, but it was very difficult to find people who had not run, which is somewhat ironic given that the overwhelming majority of people in this country do not run. We had conducted a national survey about something else and had added some questions to that about political ambition, and we found that about 96% of Americans had never even given running for office any thought. And so that wasn't going to provide a lot of additional light on gender differences. So what we did in 2001, and then we did it again in 2008, and then we did it again in 2011, was survey and interview thousands of women and men who were lawyers, business leaders, educators, and political activists. Because these are the 4 leading professions to a political career for both men and women at both the state legislative and congressional level. That's not to say there's not variation by party or by sex, but these are still the 4 leading professions across the board. And we asked, generally speaking, have you ever considered running for office? Did you ever actually run for office? And let me just show you some data. The 2001 bars, the men are blue and the women are green. We uncover a substantial gender gap in political ambition, a 16 percentage point gap in terms of have you ever thought about running for office? Now, what's important to note here is that these men and women were exactly the same in terms of their professional credentials and their educational backgrounds. They were also very similar in terms of levels of political interest and political participation. So we didn't uncover gender differences in political proximity or political interest. The differences emerged when we looked specifically at ambition. 10 years later, we surveyed a brand new crop of 4,200 people, asked the same question. This is a data analyst's dream come true. The gender gap in ambition is exactly the same size. And so if you compare the gender gap in 2001 and 2011, we see no change. This is somewhat devastating given that between 2001, when we conducted the survey, we did it in July and August, by the way, which was pre-9/11, circumstances had changed. 9/11 happened, George Bush and the war in Iraq happened, Hurricane Katrina happened, Hillary Clinton as a Democratic nominee happened, Nancy Pelosi as the Speaker of the House happened, Barack Obama happened. Doesn't matter. We also asked, are you interested in running for office in the future? Maybe they hadn't considered it, but now we're asking them to think about it. Same thing, 2001, a gender gap where men are more likely to do it. 2011, a gender gap, and actually the gender gap in 2011 is even a little bit bigger. Now you might be thinking these are really vague questions, no problem. Steps taken typically preceding a candidacy. Have you discussed raising money, speaking with other candidates, investigating how to get on the ballot, talking with party leaders, discussing running with friends and family? No matter how we try and tap political ambition, men seem more likely than women to have it and to exhibit these qualities. We also found that about 10% of the people in our sample overall had run for office, but the gender gap in actually running was roughly the same size as the gender gap in considering it. When women and men ran, they were equally likely to win their races, which is consistent with what a lot of other scholars have found, but they were far less likely to throw their hats into the ring in the first place. Okay, so why is this the case? I just want to highlight 2 reasons that this is the case. The first has to do with self-assessed qualifications. On paper, these women and men look exactly the same. If I were to show you their resumes, you would not be able to identify any difference between them. But when we asked, are you qualified to run for public office, men were 50% more likely than women to say they were very qualified, and women were twice as likely to say that they were not qualified. We thought, well, okay, maybe they don't think they're qualified to run, but they would be qualified to serve. No. How qualified are you to hold public office? The gender gaps are roughly the same. These same kinds of gaps emerge when we talk about specific political skills and characteristics as well. We asked these people who have, again, the same likelihood of engaging in these kinds of activities and having these experiences through their professional work, whether they thought they knew a lot about public policy, whether they had professional experience, whether they were a good public speaker, whether they could raise enough money, whether they were good self-promoters. Across the board, statistically significant gender differences that always work to the detriment of female candidates. And the most shocking, well, not shocking, but the biggest gap is I don't have thick enough skin. 48% of women said that compared to 29% of men. Now, part of the reason women might not think they have thick enough skin is a rational response to what they perceive as bias in the electoral environment. We ask, do you think it's more difficult for a woman to be elected? Do you think it's harder for a woman to raise money? The overwhelming majority of women say yes. It doesn't matter that systematic evidence suggests that that's not the case. If we have what look like equitable electoral outcomes, but nobody knows about that, then does it really matter? I mean, on some level, sure, except it's not necessarily going to matter for getting more women to run. We also ask, do you think that the local and congressional elections where you live are highly competitive? Women were far more likely than men to say yes, even though they lived in the same place. So there are major perceptual differences here that are working to the detriment of female candidates. Women are also less likely than men to report that they've been recruited to run for office, and we find that recruitment is an important predictor of both men and women's interest in running. But whether we're looking at party leaders, elected officials, non-elected activists, or grouping them all together as any political actor, we see a substantial gender gap that favors male candidates. This is not to say that party leaders and electoral gatekeepers are overtly sexist, but it does suggest that they're recruiting from their own networks, and in doing so, they're probably in their own networks associating with a lot of people that look very much like them. So even though they might not be going out of their way not to recruit women, there is some evidence to suggest that they're certainly not going out of their way to recruit women. Now you might be thinking, well, she's entirely glass is entirely empty, which I am in life. I mean, I should let you know this. But that the next generation is going to be different, that things are getting better, that life is good. It's not. So, and let me explain why. So in October of 2012, Richard Fox and I conducted a national survey of 4,200 high school and college students. These were boys and girls and women and men between the ages of 13 and 25, and here's what we found. Have you ever thought that someday, when you're older, you might want to run for political office? Gender gaps across the board. Now, the book we're writing right now is actually not about gender. It's called Turned Off, Why the Next Generation Has No Interest in Running for Office, because that 15 and 8, those numbers are kind of low, right? I mean, something seems fundamentally wrong with the fact that the next generation is not interested. Even if you've never thought about it, how likely would you be to run for office at some point in the future? Again, men far more likely to say definitely and maybe. If the following jobs paid the same, which would you most like to be? Business owner and teacher totally trumped mayor and salesperson, but mayor and salesperson, the gender gaps, they're not actually that different from one another. And if you break this down just by college students, it's even closer for women in terms of mayor and sales. If the following jobs pay the same, which would you most like to be? These are higher echelon positions: business executive, lawyer, principal, and member of Congress. Member of Congress loses out every day, and women, though, are still significantly less likely to say that they would want to be members of Congress. Now, something that these numbers don't show you, though, is that there's a substantial difference between high school and college students, and I just want to end on this point. The gender gap in political ambition among the high school students and the college students in our samples suggests that when you go to college, something different happens. I showed you earlier that among well-established adults in this candidate eligibility pool, the gender gap was 16 percentage points. Among college students in our sample between the ages of 18 and 25, the gender gap in political ambition was 20 percentage points. Among high school students, it was only 3 points. So this is not a situation where parents are not talking to their kids about politics. Up through high school, we are seeing very, very comparable levels of ambition. We're seeing very, very comparable circumstances. When they get to college, something changes. Women's political ambition stays flat, so the levels of ambition that they had in high school are comparable to those that they had in college. Men's levels of ambition go through the roof, and that accounts for the gender gap. And this is a terrible slide that no one should ever show, but I'm going to. You can't see it, so I'll just describe it. The first two columns are comparing high school and college, high school boys and girls in the sample. The second two are college men and women. What you need to look at are the stars. And you'll notice that for the high school students, if it doesn't have a star, that's not a significant difference. The only difference in predictors of political ambition are that high school boys are a little bit more likely, less likely than high school girls to visit political websites rarely or never. But in terms of their family experiences, whether they take political science classes, whether they're engaged in their communities, whether they think they're qualified to run, there are no differences. When you get to college, there are stars across the board. Women are less likely to be socialized to think that. They're less likely to have the political context. They're less likely to have competitive experiences. We found, for example, that playing sports and thinking that winning is very important, and running for student government and thinking that winning is very important, are big predictors of whether somebody's ambitious later in life to run for office. In high school, we don't find there to be gender differences there. By the time you get to college, college sports and student government are far less appealing to women than men. So at the end of the day, what does all of this mean? It means that we have a lot of work to do, and I think that we need to focus on college students as a way to close that gap because it's the more tangible way to focus on it. What we can do right now is encourage every young woman who is in a position to run for office later in life to seriously consider it. If a person makes a decision not to run for office, that's okay. People make decisions not to be dentists or astronauts every single day. The problem is that something is fundamentally wrong with a political system where it's not occurring to women in the first place. This could be because politics is not considered a noble profession, but it is still the place where most of the decisions get made in this country and where most people's lives are fundamentally informed. And let me just end with one anecdote. I ran for Congress in 2006. I lost. I ran in a Democratic primary in Rhode Island's 2nd Congressional District, and the margin was 60-40. And I thought that was the best thing ever, as did the media. So I'm now a big believer that a 40 is an A. Don't tell my students, though. But I can tell you that at the beginning, if you would have told me at the beginning that some of the things that were going to happen when I ran were going to happen, I probably would not have run. I called my parents to tell them that I was running for office, and they had always been supportive of everything I ever wanted to do in life. And my mother said, "We love you, but you're not allowed to run for Congress." And I said, "I don't know, what are you talking about? I'm not allowed to run for Congress." And she said, "You're a crier, and people are mean, and we don't want to deal with these phone calls every night." And I said, "No, no, no, I promise that won't happen." And so it's true. For about 2 weeks, I cried a lot. And that's exactly how long it takes to develop the thick enough skin that you need. Because what you're doing on a daily basis is so important. And the reasons that you're running are so important to you. And the people that you're interacting with are so compelling, and they need you so much, and they want you to affect change so readily that mean people on the street, and they're really pretty few and far between anyway, don't really register. And so a couple of days before the election, I was campaigning at grocery stores. We had spent hundreds of thousands of dollars. We were on TV. There was nothing else to do except get out the vote, which, by the way, voter turnout in this race was 9%. So there's another thing to investigate out there. So I'm standing at the grocery store campaigning, and this woman parks her car in the lane, and she runs up to me, and she's so excited, and she says, "Don't worry." And she clearly recognized me, and she knew who I was. And I thought, that's so nice. She's going to say, "Don't worry, you ran a great campaign," or "Don't worry, you're going to win the race." And as she approaches me, she says very loudly so everybody can hear, "Don't worry, you don't look nearly as fat in real life as you do on TV." And I said thank you, because that's what you do when someone compliments you. And the next thing I did was I called my mother, and I told her the story, and I laughed, and I said, "Really? You don't think I have thick enough skin?" And the moral of this story is that if you would have told me somebody would have said that before I announced my candidacy, I would have cried in anticipation of the comment and not gone outside for 2 weeks. And so if you doubt yourself in any way, shape, or form, just realize that the stakes are too great to worry about those kinds of doubts. Throw your hat into the ring, and encourage everybody else you know to do the same. Thank you.
Pretty sure we could do an entire forum on things people should not have said to an elected official or candidate. Oh boy, that was a great story. Next is Maria Briscoe. She is an attorney licensed to practice law in Iowa. She has a BA in criminal justice from St. Edward's University in Austin, Texas, and a JD from the University of Iowa College of Law. She retired in 2011 and in 2012 said yes to public service and agreed to run for the Iowa House of Representatives. She received 45% of the vote in a red district against a 2-term Republican incumbent, and Maria is currently running for the Iowa Senate. So please welcome Maria to the stage.
Thank you. Good morning. Can you hear me? I also have a loud voice, so I don't know when I have to get close. My name is Maria Briviesco, and I am running for the Iowa Senate, District 47. That district includes all of Bettendorf, Pleasant Valley, and the northeastern Davenport. It is really an exciting challenge that I said yes to again. In 2012, I need to tell you a little bit about 2012. When I was asked to run, I got a call out of the blue And there was like 5 people in a speakerphone, and they're like, Maria, we are calling because we want you to run for office. I go, really? Why? We believe you are so talented. And a lot of stuff for about 10 seconds, I was super flattered. I'm like, really? and then I started cross-examining them. I go, really? Tell me a little bit more. Tell me about my opponent. And they finally admitted that I had a snowball's chance in you-know-what of winning. This lady was a popular incumbent. The previous 2 elections, no Democratic candidate had stepped forward to run against this lady because it was such a Republican district. So I said, okay, let me think about it, because I had to think about it because I believe in the political process. And in order for the American political process to work, you got to participate. So that evening, I spoke to my family. My husband was for it. One of my sons was a little, he says, maybe not. And the 2 other sons said, yes, I think you should do it. On Sunday afternoon, I called them and I said, I'll do it. I'll do it. And so Monday, I signed the affidavit. The nominating petitions were somebody else was going to collect the signatures for me because I was on my way to Texas. What I had done when I retired, I promised my mother that I would go visit her once a month. So I was doing my monthly visit to Texas. So while I was in Texas, people were collecting signatures for my petition. When I arrived in Austin, Texas, where my mom was at, I told my mom, Mom, guess what I'm going to do? I'm going to run for office. They tell me I'm not going to win, but she's like, so why are you doing it? She says, you don't need the stress. You call them and tell them no. I'm like, really? This is my mother. I admire her. She's my role model. So when I called and I told them, you know what? I changed my mind. I'm not running. And then I went home where I was staying at my sister's house. The following morning, I went to see my mom. And she saw that I didn't look quite as happy as I normally do. And she says, well, do you really want to run? I says, yes, I do. She says, well, go ahead and do it, but just, my mother was protecting me. She knows that I'm very competitive and I hate to lose. So she goes, you go ahead and run, but just see it as a game. Somebody's got to win, somebody's got to lose, so do it. Once I got that blessing from my mother, I said yes. I was 100% behind it. My mom actually did a little video in Spanish saying, vote for my daughter, she's the best candidate out there. So it really was gratifying to have all my family behind me. It was a really, really difficult race in terms of that it was very Republican. I did a lot of door knocking. In fact, I looked at my walking shoes. There's holes on the bottom of my feet, the soles, from all the walking I did, because I believe that the best way to reach the people is to go and knock on their doors, shake their hands. So this time, I'm really excited. I'm an optimist at heart, and I think in order to be an optimist, you have to have faith. And in order to have faith, one of the key ingredients is to have gratitude. Now, we can all think about what we're grateful for. You know, I'm grateful for many things. One, my health, my family. And another thing I'm grateful for is that I was born in this country. This country is really fantastic. I mean, I believe in the Constitution, the separation of powers, the balancing of the powers, and I believe in the American dream. I'm living the American dream. I come from very humble beginnings. Growing up, we didn't have a lot of money, but we worked really hard. We went up to the fields in Michigan. We were migrant farm workers, but we didn't see it as adversity. We just saw it as a way of life. We were working hard. There's dignity in working. And whatever you do, there's dignity in working and earning a living. So we worked hard. My parents worked hard, and they instilled in me a good work ethic, but they also instilled in me the value of education. One of the things my parents did is they made sure that we always got back to Texas in time to go to school. Other migrant families would not do that. They had in my hometown of Mercedes, Texas, it's Mercedes just like the car, 5 miles from the Mexican border, there actually was a school just for migrants, the migrant school. I never went to that school because my parents believed in education enough to bring us back in time to go to school. Because they knew the value of an education. I know the value of an education. An education, a public education, is the best equalizer. It gives you an opportunity to succeed in this country. I'm running for office because, like I said, I believe in the American dream. I'm living the American dream, and I see that the American dream is eluding most of the American working families. It's really getting hard. I was lucky that there were some public policies in place that helped me go to college. I went to school the first year with the help of a program called the College Assistance for Migrant Programs, CAMP. That year, they really helped me a lot. They provided tutoring, they provided financial aid. There was also grants, public educational grants, the BEOG, they're called Pell Grants now. And I realized that I was the beneficiary of the public policies that President Johnson put into place under his Great Society. And I see now that the public policies, those are fading, and it's really hurting, and it's impacting the working family. And I am a great believer that we can make positive change. You just got to step up and do it. That's one of the things I taught my 3 sons. You know, don't stand on the sidelines when you can make a difference. I believe I can make a difference. I am going to work hard to make sure that all of us have the chances, that all our children have the chances that I had growing up, because it is so, so important. My youngest son is here. Hi, Andrew. I am a mother. I have 3 grown sons. My 2 youngest sons are attorneys. They're practicing with my husband, who's an attorney. My oldest son, we call him the black sheep of the family. He went to medical school. So but my 3 sons, they attended Bettendorf schools, and they were the beneficiaries of good public education. That's why I believe public education needs to be our #1 priority, especially early childhood development. I want to make sure that all our kids, while they're young, can get the best opportunities to learn. Their brains are fresh, they're like sponges, and they will pick things up. We got to give them the opportunity to excel, and that's why I'm running for office. I can make a difference, but it was hard, you know, to say yes, because I do not like to lose. You said you were an athlete. Well, I play sports too. I wasn't really like a college athlete, but I played kickball, softball, volleyball, and I am very competitive. So the hardest thing about saying yes in 2012 was knowing that I had a heart race and that I might not win. I really thought once I got in, I was going to win. I did get 45% of the vote. I think that's an A+. So, but one of the things that I detest even more than losing is apathy. And I was thinking about, why was I asked to run? I think it's because I write a lot of letters to the editor. I'm always writing letters to the editor, and I think one of them was, you know, I dislike apathy. Everybody should get involved. Everybody should register to vote. Everybody's, you know, this is the only way we can make a difference, is to stay involved. So apathy is key. I think we need to get people to register to vote. I believe more and more people are voting, are registering to vote, and I think that's what one of the things that we also need to look at is the voter suppression. We need to be on the lookout for that. The one thing that we have as citizens to make a difference is to vote. And so we need to make it easier to vote rather than harder. So that is why I'm running for office. I want to make a difference, and I will make a difference. Thank you.
Well, and I don't know about you, but I believe she'll make a difference wherever she lands, because my goodness. All right, our final panelist for her presentation is Amy Sinclair. She's the Iowa Senator from District 14. She served 2 terms on the Wayne County Board of Supervisors before being elected to the Senate. Education is a top priority for her, and after spending nearly the last 2 decades in southern Iowa, she witnessed high unemployment rates and struggles facing small business owners in the agricultural community, which is why she ran for office. So please welcome Senator Amy Sinclair.
Okay, get close, everybody. Let me just preface this with 2 things. First of all, I dropped out of college the first time around because of public speaking, just so you know. Secondly, I'm at heart a storyteller, and so I want you to come in and share a story with me, because I assumed that's why you wanted me to come today. You wanted to hear a story about a woman who decided to step into this in spite of those numbers that are so against us, okay? So let me just share. I'm not a native of Iowa. I grew up in Missouri. I grew up on a farm. pretty typical. But something is different about Missouri than there is about Iowa. Missouri politics are not like Iowa politics. You know, Missouri politics, you might go to the polls and cast your vote, and you go home and you don't think about it anymore. In Iowa, we have this amazing thing called the caucus, right? Right? You've all been to a caucus, right? Come on. Everybody's been to a caucus. It's not pretty. It's messy. It's engaged. It's local. And so that's... Let me just share that as the difference between where I grew up and where I am now. I remember in 1980 presidential elections, one of my earliest memories, it was in November, so I hadn't yet turned 5 years old, 4-year-old little girl sitting in front of the television, watching the results come in, and likely the only reason we were watching the results of the presidential election come in was because it was Missouri and we got one station, so that was what you watched. And I say that in all sincerity because my father died about 12 years ago, never having even registered to vote, and my mother she's almost 79, still hasn't. And so I did not grow up in a political family, and so for us to be watching the presidential results come in of the Reagan-Carter election wasn't necessarily something that was a part of our household. But I remember this, one of my earliest memories, and I remember watching those results come in, thinking, my gosh, because, come on, it was Ronald Reagan. He was beautiful and charming, and I heard when we went out to dinner last night the phrase Teflon Ron. Everything about him was just amazing, and to this not quite 5-year-old little girl, that's what I saw. I saw this amazing guy, and I was so excited to watch those results come in. Why? I have no idea. I really have no idea. But it's one of those memories that stick with you. You know, let's fast forward to I've always been very engaged in public policy. I was my junior class treasurer. I was my senior class vice president, which really all that does is make you have to plan your class reunions. That's really all that office gives you, is that for every 5 years after that, you actually have to go back home. I've always been engaged in being a part of the process. I've loved it, even from that time when I was 4 years old, watching those results come in. I registered to vote at high school. In Missouri, it's your county clerk that comes in, and she registered us. And I registered to vote there at 18 years old. I've voted in every election since then, primaries and school board elections, take your pick. I want to be involved in the process. But I wasn't ever really super engaged in the process until about 10 years ago, I think it was. You know, we had our county caucus. My very first caucus in Iowa. I'd lived in Iowa a few years, but I'd never gone to those caucuses. I thought, oh, if I'm voting, that's enough, right? But for some reason, my husband and I decided to go. Should I rewind? I do have a husband and children. It's not just this crazy redhead who can't public speak out there on her own. I have a husband, Boyd, who is an elementary principal, and 3 children. Evan is graduating this year and is currently my clerk. Mitchell is a freshman in high school and has also started, he's also a freshman in college, so go Mitchell. And at 14, we love those kids. They talk about the tiger mom. That's me. That's me. And then I have my midlife crisis, Carter 7, and he's fun. Anyway, so my husband and I, we packed up our kids. Carter didn't exist at the time, but we packed up the younger 2, and we went to our local caucus. And I walked in, and I may be a little snarky. I don't know if you noticed that. I'm not always the kindest person, and that's probably a good thing, because given what we do, what was it called last night? The Iowa legislature is like the boys' middle school locker room where everybody's running for class president. Isn't that how she described it? And that's true. That's true. So it's probably a good thing I'm not very nice. But I walked into my county caucus, and there was a gentleman there who had run for office before, and he didn't recognize me, and he lost, and God love him, he tried and did a very good job, but he did lose, and he ran for state senate. And I walked in, and he didn't know me, I knew him. That's how it goes when you put yourself out there. And he introduced himself to me, and I said, "Nice to meet you, I'm Amy Sinclair, I'll be your next senator." I was joking. It was a lie. I was pretending. Participated in the caucus, had a really good time, went home, and my phone rang that next afternoon, and the gentleman who I'd poked at said to me, "You know, I'd really like to come and talk to you if you wouldn't mind." And I said, "Sure, no problem." And that a couple hours later, he and another gentleman showed up on my doorstep, and they knocked on the door, and they walked in. And we sat down at the table, and I was chatting away and not really understanding what they were there for. And he said, you know, Amy, Senate's a big task to take on." And I said, I was kidding. And he said, "I'm not. Let's start a little smaller. There's a gentleman on the ballot for county supervisor." By the way, I was 28, 2 young kids at home, not in any way really considering looking at politics. I enjoyed being I'm not a soccer mom, I'm a football mom. I'm a little more aggressive than what soccer is, you know. But I enjoyed being mom and helping out on the farm. I have working mud boots, though they are pink. You can't just go out in them. You gotta be classy even when you're pulling calves, right? He showed up and he said, let's start smaller. There's a guy on the ballot who's been a supervisor for 12 years now. He's unopposed, and nobody should go unopposed on the ballot. It's a form of accountability. And I thought, well, yeah, that's right. And then he said, "You're gonna lose. Don't worry about it. But we need somebody on the ballot." I said, "Okay, I can be a loser. I'd never lost before, but we'll give it a go, right? Not a problem." And about that time, my son Mitch, who was 4 and really had an aversion to clothes, wandered out of the bubble bath wearing nothing but the bubbles. And I thought, oh my gosh, this is going to go downhill, isn't it? But they left. I put my name, like you said, you sign the affidavit, you get your signatures, and you run with it. That summer, my older brother, who was my hero, was killed, and I kind of stopped campaigning. And so the night of the election, well, first of all, I won the primary, which was a shocker anyway, because I was this young girl. You know, that's what they say. It's a young girl doing running anyway. You heard that, right? Yeah. And I didn't get you look thinner in person. I got the, man, you can't wear that sweater. It makes you look too tiny.
I would have taken that.
Yeah, it's just as bad. It really is. Anyway, I won the primary and then kind of stopped campaigning. With anybody lose a sibling, it's rough. You kind of lose focus on you refocus on what matters. You refocus on what, and I refocused on what mattered. But we went ahead. We put the ads in the paper, even though we'd kind of stopped doing the formal campaigning. But election night came, and the gentleman who had said, you need to run, he called me up and said, "You'll probably lose, but you need to be at the courthouse when the results come in just because it looks better." Okay. And so I packed up and went to the courthouse, and of course, my competitor and all of his family were there, and they were over, talking with everybody at the courthouse because he'd been there 12 years, and this was home to him, and everybody knew him. So my husband and I were sitting in a corner, trying to be inconspicuous, really not wanting to draw attention to ourselves. And the first precinct came in, and I won. And the second precinct came in, and I won. And the third precinct came in, and I won. And the fourth precinct came in, and I lost. But it's his hometown. And the fifth precinct came in, and I barely lost. And the sixth and the seventh, I won, and I won, and I won. And 2 precincts left, and the gentleman who had asked me to run came over, and he said, "You're looking a little pale." And I said, "Yeah, you told me I'd lose, and now I'm not, and I don't know what to do." And that's the reality of life, and I won. And I went into office, and I did great things for Wayne County. I love Wayne County. It's home. We live on a 125-year family farm, and so it mattered. Ooh, gotta speed this thing up. I told you I wouldn't take the whole time, but here I did. Storyteller and all, you guys are leaning in. I won, and I did good work. And I had a baby in office, so I didn't run again. you know, that midlife crisis. Apparently it wasn't running for office, it was having a child. But I didn't immediately run again, and I took 2 years off, and I saw a 25% increase in my property taxes that year. And so I ran again in 2 years, and I won. And I saw, especially in that second term, I saw that disconnect between what happens at the local level, where politics really happens. All politics are local. Everything that happens at the State House has an effect on your local governments, and your local governments are truly what affect you most. And so we got redistricted, the whole reapportionment, the whole new districts, and the districts happened, and somebody said, "So you thinking about running?" I said, "No, there are 2 incumbents, and I'm fine with both of them. Why would I run?" And then my senator announced his retirement. And while he was announcing his retirement on the radio, the gentleman, you remember 10 years ago, that gentleman who asked me to run for Board of Supervisors called me up and said, "Hey, Amy, did you hear?" I said, "No, I didn't hear. I'm reading a book in my bedroom. What did I hear?" And he said, "Senator McKinley is retiring, and you need to do it." And I laughed. No, I don't. No, I don't. I don't. And I hung up the phone, and I did. And I did. And I did. And it wasn't that favorable a district for me. It's favorable for my affiliation. It's a Republican district. It's Southern Iowa. We're all friendly and conservative. That's how you do. But it wasn't necessarily. You know, there are some districts that are just landslides for one party or the other. Mine isn't. I had a 3-way primary. Campaigning is so ugly. It's so ugly. My 3-way primary included another woman, and God love her, she got in a bar fight during the primary. Which is all well and good until the sheriff of one of my counties called me up and said, "Amy, was that you in the bar fight?" No, I didn't get in the fight. Campaigning's tough. Primaries are great. Anybody looking to run, you should always have a primary, because a primary makes you a stronger candidate. I remember winning the primary, and I had 66%, and a sitting senator called me up and he said, "Hey, good job, Amy. You could have done better. You could have gotten the full 2/3. I coulda. I didn't. It's because she got in the bar fight. It got her some name recognition. She should never have gotten 6%. Oh, 2 minutes. Let's wrap this up. I worked hard. I knocked on every door in the district, because that's what you do. You work hard. And I won. I won not the 60-40. I won 61-39. And it wasn't because I should have had those votes. It's because I worked hard, and the message matters. And you know what? You are exactly right. People don't care if you're male or female when they're electing you. They care if you're real. And they care if you're going to represent what matters to them. And frankly, they care if you're going to work hard and do the job they send you to do. Women in politics is no different than men in politics, except we have to choose to do it. We have to step out there. You do become vulnerable. My gosh, you become vulnerable. I had members of my own party campaigning against me because I didn't agree exactly with what they said. I didn't have problems raising money. I did have a good network. I was asked. I didn't have support from the party necessarily. I had that primary, and it was a 3-way primary, and so they weren't getting involved. And so by that time, I had my network arranged, my funds raised, and my plans in place. So I didn't really need party support once the general election came. But the fact of the matter is, it is a different process for women to run than it is for men. I will never forget being told, "Amy, you need to make sure your makeup's on all the time. But perhaps you should do something with your hair. Maybe you should buy something a little more conservative to wear." As you can tell, I listened to all of that. I walk in, and Nancy and Sandy and Liz, you know what, these women in the Senate are all so put together, and I am not. My hair's flying away. I barely have my shoes on my feet. But it doesn't matter. You get in there, you do the job. It's different for women, but it does work, and we can do it. And I'm going to wrap up because Renee needs to come back up here and let you guys ask questions if you'd like. Thank you for having me.
So we have about 15 minutes, maybe a little bit more, and you should have cards that look like these that are out there that people, that she has there if you'd like one. I only have one, so I would recommend you give me a couple more. But the first question, and I'm just going to let anybody that wants to answer, it says, recent Supreme Court rulings have opened the floodgates for super PACs, which chips away at the role of party committees. If women lean on party support more than men, does this suggest a gender gap is likely to change? And the follow-up to that was, and how does decreasing influence of parties affect women in general? Does anybody want to talk about that? I mean, in your case, Senator, they didn't really have party support, so maybe this doesn't really apply, but maybe you should start and just tell us what you think.
Yeah, and I guess that's just, for me, that doesn't matter. Because like I said, if you have a primary, your party's not necessarily going to get involved anyway. And primary is the best thing that could possibly happen to any candidate ever. Women, men, it doesn't matter. I would recommend not getting involved in bar fights.
So I guess, I think that's something that we need to watch, because there is a lot of evidence that women are not giving money, to the same extent as men. Women and men are doing well. Women are doing well when they run and are able to raise money, but we're kind of in a new era, so I think we really need to watch this. One thing we find in our study is that women state legislators definitely think it's harder for women to raise money than it is for their male colleagues. There's a huge gender gap on that issue in our survey, so that's a perceptual difference. Women state legislators don't think they have the same access to the networks that their male candidates have access to, so I think we definitely need to be concerned about that.
Anybody else want to comment on money in politics?
Well, I think it's the hardest thing as a candidate for me, and I think for most of the women in all candidates, is raising money, making those phone calls. And I don't know about this, I didn't really get a lot of party money last time. I'm hoping that will change this time. But if not, I think that the large influx of money that's going to be coming in is going to be critical for our coming elections. And I think in Iowa, we're going to have to rely on the common sense of the people to ignore all those commercials that are going to be aired and just think about the people, the candidates running, and the issues. And I have confidence in Iowans being able to do that.
Thank you. All right, our second note says, I'm a 25-year-old woman who has thought often of running for office, but I've concluded that I probably will not. This decision came from the fact that with social media present during my formative years, there's a treasure trove of potentially embarrassing photos or comments. What would you, this is a very important question. What would you recommend to young women who worry about the potential of being subjected to, quote, dirty politics and might not have a thick skin?
So can I respond? First of all, just take that stuff down. Like, just delete it. Second, don't let people put more up, like have very restrictive settings. But the third thing I would say is, at this point in time, it's going to be incredibly unlikely that within the next 5 or 6 years, every candidate who's under the age of 40, who's running for anything, doesn't have skeletons in his or her virtual closet, right? And so, if you think about it now, it's totally fine for the President of the United States to admit that he smokes pot, or smoked pot, right? He's not. We haven't reached the next stage yet, but in 10 years, we'll probably be there. In 1992, Bill Clinton had to say that he didn't inhale, right? And so if you think about the evolution of what becomes acceptable, a lot of it is linked to the way that society evolves, what technology is like. And so I would definitely say, don't worry about that. Don't exacerbate it. Don't make it worse. Don't do things that would lead any employer or anybody in any profession to question your morals or your ethics or your professionalism. But I don't think that you should write this off because when you were 17, you did something that you probably shouldn't have done. This is, by the way, coming from someone who's literally never done anything wrong in her life. So, I mean, that was one problem we did not have when I was running for office.
I'm a character, if you couldn't tell, and I have those skeletons. In fact, let's talk about, I have these old posts on Facebook. My best friend posted a picture of me in pink spandex from last summer, so don't exacerbate it, don't worry about it. The reality of it is what matters is what you're doing now and whether or not you are reflective of your district and are willing to work hard to do that job. And don't cry about it. For the love of all that's holy, don't cry.
There's no crying in politics.
There's no crying in politics. Just
So I do have a story when I was first running for office. And I won't name a party or year because that may make it a little more vague who did this. But one particular party decided to do opposition research against me, and I got a call from who was my leader in the party at the time, who called me and asked me, I have a really difficult question to ask you. Have you been arrested for drinking and driving 3 times? And I'm sitting there going, no. They had looked under, my legal first name is Carolyn, and apparently the opposition research folks were not smart enough to determine that the Renee Schulte that they were looking at had a different birthday than me, wasn't me, and I was going to have ads against me on drunk driving that I didn't even do, and it wasn't even me. And so I just share that with you, that because there are some things that you might have done that are truly on your Facebook page, per se, there's a whole lot of things you're going to get accused of in a campaign that you didn't have anything to do with at all. And so if you sit back worried about what people are going to accuse you of, you're not going to get very far, because the stuff they're going to make up is well better than anything you could have ever pulled off on your Facebook page. Guaranteed. Well, example, my first campaign, my face was side by side with George Bush on television. I don't know George Bush. I never met the guy. But my face and his, like, we're best buddies. So just so you know. Just as an example. Okay. How is it best, or what method is it for women to handle the media? How do you handle media? And then how should women handle negative media or negative questions? Is that different for women than men? How do we handle the media?
I mean, so I'll give a two-pronged answer to this. The first is, if you're interested in running for office, talk to them whenever they want to talk to you, because cultivating those relationships is one of the best ways to ensure that they'll then cover what you want to cover when you want them to cover it. And so this is not to say that you should give them an answer you think that they would want to hear, or that you should be particularly controversial or not, but if they call you and you're in your campaign office, you can always have time to take that call. It's one of the best ways to get attention. The other thing that I would say is, and I know that research is mixed on this and pollsters are mixed on a lot of this, your goal is to always, when you're running for office, make sure that your message is at the forefront of the agenda. And so if you're asked a question, or if you're accused of something that you do not think you should have been accused of, or you do not think is relevant, I don't think you necessarily have to call them out as horrible people all the time. You can just say, what I'm here to talk about today is such and such. Because again, you don't want to repeat something that's not necessarily true. You don't want to give credence to a line of argumentation that you don't think merits attention. You're running for a particular reason. You have your own message. You're on your own mission. And I just think that they can't quote you on anything you didn't actually say. And so say what you want coverage about.
Anyone else?
Stay on message. It seems to me if you get coverage, that's key. The more often you get calls, the better. And just stay on message, tell your message, and I think it all works out. I don't think they're trying to trick you. I think when they call you, they really want an answer, and you give them the best answer you can.
Two things I would say. Any media is good media. Seriously, my opponent who got in the bar fight would not have gotten the 6% that she got had she not gotten into the bar fight and been in the news. She wouldn't have. And it's plain and simple. In fact, they were using it as campaign material. She'll fight for you. Indeed. The second thing I would say, I'll just share, we talk about women needing support. I immediately, when I decided to run, I hadn't really shared it with anyone, and a gentleman that I'd known from years before, hadn't seen in years, seriously, called me up one afternoon and said, "Hey, Amy, do you know of anyone interested in running for the Senate seat?" And I said, "Well, curious you would ask, Chris, because I've kind of decided in my head that I will. Boyd and I are just waiting to figure out how to take that first step." And he said, "Good, Amy, that's what I wanted to hear. Let me help you." And he did, and eventually I hired him and his partner to work with me with communications and with just management, if you will. You need a handler. My gosh, you don't know where you are day to day. You need somebody to tell you. And so I hired them, and every time before I would go into a speaking opportunity, into a debate, into anything, I would call him up and say, do you have any advice for me today? Is there anything new I'd need to know? And he told me every time he would tell me whatever tidbit mattered. But then he would say, there are 3 words you need to remember, Amy. 3 words you need to remember, Amy. Just be you. You know what? If you use that as your maxim, you're not going to have to try and recreate yourself every time you talk to somebody new in the media. They're going to know what to expect. Just be you. And that was seriously the best advice I've ever gotten from anyone on anything political or otherwise, because it just makes life that much easier.
One of the tips that I was given that was very helpful to me was I often will, if a reporter calls, I'll take the call, but I will ask them, can I ask what it's regarding, and then what's your deadline, and can I call you back? And never have I had somebody upset with me that I wouldn't give a comment off the cuff, and never did that ever come back to bite me. Because if you ask them, you know, how soon do you need this? Can I ask what it's regarding? So that you can get out of wherever you are, think a minute of what you want to say, and then just call back when it's clear. Because I could be in the car, and I don't want to have that quote on if they're recording it or whatever, maybe with a noise in the background or just whatever. And so it makes a lot of sense just to return it from your desk or wherever so you can clear your head. And nobody ever said a bad thing. We have another question about how does anyone afford to run? Do you have to give up your occupation?
So overall, there are 520,000 elective offices in this country, literally. We tend to think of Congress, both the House and the Senate, we think of the presidency. There are only 537 of those. Now, this is not to say that there aren't some very competitive state legislative races, some very competitive local races. Mayor of New York City, for example, is, you know, a multi-million-dollar endeavor. But the overwhelming majority of these offices do not require a full-time commitment. Most of them do not require hundreds of thousands of dollars in terms of campaigning either. And so it's important, I think, not to make large generalizations about the role of money, because I think that can be off-putting, the same way that thinking about politics through a national lens can be off-putting. In a lot of places, you keep your full-time job and you engage in politics, not necessarily on the side, but just as one other facet of what it is that you do on a day-to-day basis. And so in the overwhelming majority, like literally hundreds of thousands of offices, we're not talking about large amounts of money.
We did invest in my campaign because, again, you have that primary, and until you get through a primary, nobody's giving money to you until you get through a primary. So we did invest our own money, and we went into it knowing that we would be investing our own money, and we were okay with that. As far as the I did have to quit my job to do what I'm doing. I managed all of the office functions and staff and HR and what have you for a local company. And you know, funny how people want to get paid even though you're not around. So I did quit my job. You don't have to. I just felt that my boss deserved more than what I would have been able to give during the session, and that was a choice that I made personally.
Well, that's a very good question, because I'm retired, and I don't know how people have a job and do the campaigning and go up to the Senate Sunday through Thursday, or, you know. I think it would be really difficult to have a job and to be in elected office. And I don't think the salary is that much. What is it, $25,000? We don't do it for the money, right? But when I ran in 2012, I was told by someone that I needed to raise $100,000. I said, you gotta be kidding. How am I gonna raise $100,000? Well, I raised enough to have a credible campaign, $37,000, just about, more or less, you know. What I really had was just a grassroots campaign, and I think that's the most effective. Now, getting back to the media and what you said, it's so important to be yourself. I want to share a story with you. When the Quad City Times called, you know, they were having interviews with all the candidates with the editorial board. So I went to the Quad City Times, and there's this beautiful conference table, and the editor says, you know, you're sitting in the chair where, you know, President Obama said, and all these important people. All of a sudden, I got flustered, you know, so I was talking, and I was trying to tell them that I had a grassroots campaign, and I couldn't think of the word grassroots. So I said, well, we have like a Green Acres type of campaign. But I was just being myself, so it was good, you know, they relaxed after that.
So I guess just to echo what people are saying on the panel, I think there are a lot of different offices out there, and a lot of it is personal, but what you do in terms of how you decide to campaign for what and whether you can balance what you know, an occupation with that. But in terms of the fundraising, I would just say, because I don't want to seem too negative, that there are a lot of examples where women are outraising men, right? So women Senate candidates, for example, in the last cycle were record-breaking. Elizabeth Warren in Massachusetts, for example. Hillary Clinton, you know, broke records as a female presidential candidate. So I think it's not something that can't be done, right? Everyone has to learn. Men have to do it too. I mean, in our survey, men were less likely than women to say it's harder for women, but what they're saying is it's hard for everybody, right? It's just hard to raise money, but I think most people, so I'm the only person who hasn't run for office on this panel, but what I've heard is that you don't have to personally have a lot of money to run for office. You have to, though, be able to be willing and able to ask for money, and that's something that, you know, you can get trained to do, right? There are people who are there to help you figure that out. You're not the first person to have you know, had to learn how to do that. So I think I just want to be kind of more positive about the doability of that.
And if I could just add, it's similar to the thick skin. It got to the point where when I was running, I was spending about 7 hours a day on the phone doing fundraising calls, because for the first 8 months I didn't ask anybody for money and just thought that they would find me so appealing they'd send it in. And then we were about to close down the office because we couldn't pay the rent. And so I had to spend quite a bit of time. And I can honestly say that I never did not feel nauseous, right? Because you're asking people to give you, that you've often never met, for more money than they can afford, to somebody that they are just going to assume is going to do a good job. But similar to the thick skin, it just becomes something that you have to do, and you don't enjoy it, but you just do it. And we would have little games for me, like instead of the 7 hours, if I would stop complaining, I could finish after 100 phone calls, right? And so, like, we would motivate me in different ways. After 11 calls, I could get a Diet Pepsi. After 15, maybe I could go to the bathroom. And the only person that enjoyed it worst was the guy that had to sit there with me all day while I was making the calls. But you do it because that's the only way that you can then get your message out. Knocking on doors is great, but you also need to, in most cases, especially for federal offices, buy media time, and that costs a lot of money, and I didn't have any, so I had no choice but to raise it.
And I have found that myself in my own campaign, I was number 6 in the State House my last year for fundraising, and I had only been there 2 terms. And it had everything to do with setting goals for myself and making it a game to see. I didn't know what other people had in their minds to raise, so I would pick numbers for them and then try to beat them, because I'm a very competitive type person. So my first term, I mean, I outraised our majority, the whip, in my second term, just because I figured he probably wasn't working that hard. So I just thought, well, I'll just see if I can beat him. I wouldn't tell him that, but then I'd wait for those reports to come out and figure out that I was ahead, and I'd be very excited that I was winning. And so, all by myself. I mean, nobody else knew that I was excited about this. But I mean, it is possible. And when you believe in yourself and you're this is an investment in a cause bigger than you. It's not asking for personal money. It's not about you personally. It's about an investment in your cause. And if you can figure that out, the best fundraisers around the world in nonprofits, in business, in a lot of places are women. That skill translates into campaigns. We just have to help them understand that it's not different. And so just not thinking that you're going to be on the downside of that is going to be the key. So it's the perception that's the problem, not the reality of what's actually out there. I want to say thank you for our time this morning. We're wrapping up our portion of this. I don't know, on the agenda it says you have a 15-minute break, and we will have, are you coming back to the stage? All right, we're going to come back for our break. But thank you.